First of all, thank you for taking some time out of this very uncertain moment we're both experiencing. You were very kind. You replied to my message, and I didn't realize it was Easter Sunday when I sent you a message, and you were very, very generous with your time, and you even agreed to do this on a fairly short notice. So I appreciate that. And I know these are strange times. Even when you're at home among relatives, it might make it even stranger that you're stuck with people that you're not used to being stuck with all the time. But this type of isolation is something I've never experienced before. This type of social distancing, I think most of us have never really had to deal with. But you and I are not from a place that's known for social distancing or isolation. And I know you're not Lebanese, but I consider you Lebanese at this point. You've spent too much time there. And I think you're more in tune than I am in some ways to the Lebanese scene. So as a fellow Lebanese, what is it like to be very distant and very isolated, especially having witnessed what we witnessed a few months ago? How does it feel like to you?
Yes, well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And I will say, I think in the last episode of the podcast, you kind of talked about this as well. And, when the Lebanese Revolution was happening, you felt there was this hope and this optimism. And obviously, as you said, I am not Lebanese, but I spent most of my adult life in Lebanon.
You're Lebanese now.
So on the inside, I feel Lebanese. And to kind of witness that and see people coming together and extend themselves, some of the things that were so empowering about the revolution, people camping out, people ordering menaish for each other from abroad, or all these things that couldn't even happen right now. And, the way that people really took care of each other during the revolution and created this social cohesion that many said they never thought they would see in Lebanon. I was living in Beirut, and my friends there, they were saying, never in my life did I think when someone in southern Lebanon needed blood that I would go and donate for them. And to see that and to hear that, and now to kind of be together, but we have to be separate, is really, it's a big cognitive dissonance.
I think it's something that it's maybe even, perhaps it's too soon to properly reflect on, because these are emotions I'm only beginning to feel now. Having spent a few weeks now in New York, more or less alone, more or less indoors. I mean, I was in Beirut up until late January. And those 3-4 months of proper euphoria on the streets of Beirut. And I mean, your story is one example of living in Beirut and caring about Saida in a way that's almost unusual in Lebanese history, and it's positive change. And that kind of intimacy, that kind of bonding on the streets, very rarely could you go home and be alone. Very rarely would you want to be alone. And then now it's loneliness. And maybe it's a healthy thing. I'm not sure. I actually don't know if this is maybe a once in a lifetime opportunity to reflect, to properly reflect. Are you more hopeful as somebody who's now spent their adult life in Lebanon, if you go back later, that this country will emerge and will sort of be able to stand on its own 2 feet down the road? And do you anticipate from your own eyes, I know it's sort of, I'm putting a lot on you here, but that the future is bright for Lebanon?
I mean, obviously you could write books on that subject. I think for me, I've always, when I moved to Lebanon, I was 24. So I was very idealistic and optimistic. And that was when the Syrian civil war had just started, and there was the Arab Spring. And I think that being there in that time and seeing all these people stand up, all these Arab countries stand up and want democracy, and then seeing most of those movements not succeed or succeed not in the timeline that we maybe thought. And again, I think that was definitely my idealism. I think that the Lebanese Revolution, I'm really happy that I was there in October, because I think that I'm not as optimistic as I was or idealistic as when I was younger, but it was so powerful to see people come together in a way that I never thought was possible, especially again after having lived in the region and seen these, seen student revolutions
Yeah.
squashed by, dictatorships and other kinds of things. And to see people despite all of that. And I think that was the most powerful thing for me, was to know that all of my friends that were Lebanese, like, they knew what the protests were costing them. They knew that going into the streets meant, half of my friends didn't even have job. Like, they were all basically furloughed at that point. Like accountants, architects, jobs that you don't think of as being like that would easily come or go. And to know that, and then the other half that still had jobs and felt lucky, they decided to put that on the line. And that, like, just seeing another human do that, I don't think in America we've ever been challenged that way. Obviously, the pandemic is different, and I think we're seeing people rise to the occasion. But I was just so impressed by the Lebanese spirit, that people knew they were in a terrible economy and they were gambling it all for this future and this dream that they knew would maybe be impossible.
Now, I apologize. I think you've probably answered this question in different outlets, but I've never asked you this question directly, and I'm very curious. What took you to Lebanon? And I know that, I've seen snippets of this in various outlets. You've been interviewed about your Lebanese experience. But you tell me, what took you to Lebanon?
It's, that's the $1 million question. I studied Middle Eastern studies in university, so I was always interested, and I always wanted to live in the Middle East. My roommate in college was Kuwaiti. I had a Lebanese friend in college. At the time, I was 23 and living in New York City, and I knew I wanted to live in the Middle East, and I was looking at a map, and I knew I wanted to learn like Levantine Arabic, because to me it was like the easiest. I just liked how it sounded. And Lebanon's on the sea, and I'm a surfer, so I don't know. But it fits really well.
Because I'm going to now tease you a bit. The Mediterranean waters are not famous for their surfing, although you kind of did that, and we're going to get into that. Levantine Arabic is probably... you don't go to Lebanon to learn Arabic.
Nope, and definitely not.
I'll ask you later whether or not you got your dialect game on. And the third thing, I love that you had a Kuwaiti roommate and you chose Lebanon instead. So that's the whole package. I'll get close enough, but I won't go there.
That's okay. I told him once that he was like maybe the impetus, and Faisal, he was like, I hate Lebanon though. And I was like, I don't know, Faye. I'm sorry. I don't know.
This was your Lebanese friend or your Kuwaiti roommate?
My Lebanese friend was great. Really
yes.
nice.
Okay, good. So he charmed you enough to take you across the globe. And I like that there's a little globe behind you during this episode.
Oh,
so
yeah. I was going to move it, but I figured.
Yeah, we can leave it on the ocean for now. It's okay. So you in a way, I mean, it's just by accident that you spent that much time there. You weren't planning on any dramatic move. This was just sort of an exploration. It could have lasted months instead of nearly a decade. That the living there was sort of not anticipated.
I think when I first moved there, I'd planned to live there for at least a year, and then I got hired as the editor-in-chief of StepFeed when I was like 26, so 2 years later. And I'd been doing tech reporting, and I think because I was reporting on the tech industry, like in 2013, it was a really interesting time, especially in Lebanon. That was when they did the BDL circular, and there were like Anghami had just moved to Dubai, so there was a lot of kind of positive, interesting news. And then I came back to the States at that in like 2016 or 2017, and obviously it was really nice being close to my family, but I just realized like my professional network and my friends and the things that I identify with as an adult are all in Lebanon / the Middle East. So, and that's still something that I'm struggling with, like that kind of divided spirit.
But I'm glad you mentioned, and you said it, that you sort of stumbled into a career, if I may, because I don't think you planned on being a journalist per se. That kind of just happened while you were there with the StepFeed, I moved to become a journalist, but I don't think I ever
I'd been doing communications and I knew I wanted to get into journalism. I didn't think that I was going to love it. It was kind of something to try, for sure.
But you definitely tried it. And
Yeah.
And you've done it sort of for quite some time now. I'm curious about the travel journalism sort of world. And I know that that's not the only thing you focus on, but when it comes to your name and your work, I know it mostly through that angle. And I'm just curious, the fascination about Beirut. Going back a little earlier, I think this was 2009, if I'm not mistaken. The New York Times ran a piece, Beirut, the #1 city to visit. And I hope I got that. Maybe it's 2010. It's around that time. And I mean, it's very startling to see that on the New York Times. This is the #1 destination. And I was lucky because I was giving a tour mostly to locals and some Lebanese expats. There wasn't a very big tourism scene, and you know this, that Beirut had sort of emerged from the 2006 war in a very difficult sort of terrain. Domestic politics was taking its toll on Lebanon. And then out of nowhere, it just sort of, out of the blue, Beirut is the comeback city. And, you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. You have Gulf tourists visiting. You have Europeans from the Gulf visiting. You have Americans booking Travelocity and these sort of Expedia excursions to Beirut. And I was there. And out of nowhere, this tour that I used to give, which you've been on, became a big thing. And I was not expecting those numbers. I really wasn't expecting it. And just if you can maybe sort of take me on the journey of travel reporting and maybe your own sort of take on it, and what is it exactly when you're trying to tell a story of a city to a foreign audience? Maybe what matters to you in particular, as opposed to just sort of a generic, this is what you should do and this is what you should see. That sort of, I think anyone could do that. But what is it about that world and what is meaningful to you, at least in the Beirut context? What did you take from that experience?
I mean, I think travel writing is one of those interesting fields of journalism because when it's done well, I think it can be incredible. Some of my favorite pieces of journalism have been travel writing. And then it can also be a complete disaster. I don't think there's another kind of journalism where you kind of either get like the best and the worst, And Lebanon, Beirut in particular, I think sometimes, we've all seen those kind of visit Lebanon pieces that aren't really offering anything and give this kind of weird advice and that kind of stuff. For me personally, it started, when I was working for Forbes, one of the editors that I used to put on TV, she knew I was moving to Lebanon to become a journalist. And so she said I could write her these like postcards from Beirut on my first impressions. And so I wrote her one, and I actually kind of became like a little bit internet famous within 5 days of getting to Lebanon, which is, I feel like now I know it's like the perfect Lebanon introduction.
Oh, so that was really early on in your stay that you did that within a week.
So it was like my kind of first impressions of Beirut, and a lot of people there got upset because they felt like if Forbes was sending a journalist, like it should be a finance, economic look at Lebanon. And I was like, I'm a 24-year-old. I just moved to this city. But then I got more into tech reporting because travel journalism is difficult to break into, I think. A lot of people want to do it. There isn't that much money in it when you look at other kinds of journalism like tech or business. And I also think the pieces that I really like and the kind of writing I like, it requires a time spent in that place, similar to, your Walk Beirut tours, where the reason why people like that is because you're weaving for them these history, your own personal stories, and you also kind of know what to highlight. And I think when I think of the travel stories that I'm really proud of myself that I've done, they're from places that I feel I really know about, either through reading and through time spent there, and then also just conversations with people. And I think that can be the hard part of it, is going to a place and then finding those stories or knowing those stories.
But I'm curious because I mean, I've met so many students turned journalists in the Beirut scene. I think all of them.
Yeah.
I mean,
Journalist city.
It's interesting. It's a big circle, but it's also a very small circle at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a transient one. And Beirut is usually the springboard. I mean, a good example is the Daily Star. People just sort of enter through that internship program. They become journalists and then they take off. But travel reporting in that kind of world, I don't know. Actually, I know maybe I can count them on one hand, and you're one of them. Why did you? I mean, aside from that storytelling arc, which I think is maybe it's in a way it's a challenge for any type of journalism, but that kind of human maybe approach as opposed to just generic bullet points. What took you to travel reporting as opposed to, let's say, a standard reporter on politics or economics? What was it about travel that sort of interested you?
Yeah, I think I was trained as a fiction writer. And so for me, journalism was always this way to practice writing and get paid for it. Which is, that's like, I'm always like, I went into journalism for the money, and people are like, you picked the wrong.
I was going to say, well done.
Exactly. But from my perspective, it makes sense. And I think for me, travel writing is this opportunity to kind of have this narrative form. It can have you in it, and a lot of times when someone is in a place, like their own understanding filtered into the actual facts is, I think, what can make it really shine. And a lot of times I do think we need political reporting. I think we need war journalism. I think we need business reporting. In that sense, I'm a journalist and I believe in the truth and the importance. But there's also a lot in the media industry. And, I've spent the 12, almost 13 years of my career exclusively in the media industry and on the business and on the reporting side. And there is a lot that, I've done interviews where people ask me, like, what's the media culture in the Middle East like versus America? And on one hand, you can easily say, okay, in Dubai, you can't write about Etisalat because they're not going to, or you can't write bad things about their telecoms company because the state owns it. But I could write a story about them in Lebanon and it's fine,
Oh, so the breathing space was, I mean, Beirut was the natural setting for it because you can explore that more so as opposed to other cities.
But I think to continue with that idea, I think in all kinds of journalism, you suffer from that. Like even in America, Washington Post is owned by Amazon. They're owned by Jeff Bezos, but there's no way that they're doing investigative reports into Amazon with Jeff Bezos as the kind of head of the company. So I think that for me, I've always been motivated by people's stories, and I feel that there's a specific truth in a human story that I've always found really beautiful. And that, I think, is what has taken me to travel journalism. Sometimes I feel like I don't necessarily fit in the travel bucket, but
what is that? What is the travel bucket?
Well, I mean, there's
like you don't have any scars to show, is that
Well, there's like a whole world of travel journalism that you might not. There's like the points people who report on how to like fly around the world.
Oh, I see, that kind of more pretentious take on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to say that because I interviewed them and they're all very nice people, tend to be really nerdy, but if you put me in a lineup of travel journalists, there's the kind of luxury, travel to visit a hotel and be like, these linen sheets aren't to my standards.
Right.
So
although it's interesting because Beirut caters to that audience too. And
definitely.
I think that may have been at some point a very sizable market, at least when it comes to regional tourism to Lebanon.
I mean, that's always the thing about Lebanon that's so fascinating to me. It's, on one hand you have like the Four Seasons and the Phoenicia, and then like less than a mile away you have places where the like electricity is intermittent, and it does not look like that, and I don't think there's a lot of cities in the world that are still like that.
I mean, this will be maybe for the audience listening and watching, I think this will make sense. I have met many guests on the tour, and also just sort of visitors, but they tend to be European or American or Australian, that they just booked in the Phoenicia Hotel without really realizing what that is.
Oh,
They got a deal and they ended up in the Phoenicia. And I mean, of course, this, the name kind of, you associate that with luxury. And sometimes the deals are really good, becomes cheaper than other sort of expensive hotels in Beirut. And I remember somebody asking me if they could take a service to the Phoenicia. And I said, I've never heard anyone sort of tell the service or servicen à Phoenicia. I told him, it's better if you just give a location nearby and walk it, because you're not going to pay 2,000 lira to get to the Phoenicia. They're going to charge you 10 times, 100 times that. But but you're right. Beirut is that kind of place where you can have extreme sort of luxury next to very and even the Phoenicia itself. I mean, it's part of the Green Line, and there are abandoned hotels next door. Case in point, the Holiday Inn right behind it. And that's the view of half of the hotel. So you're right, there is that kind of very sort of sharp contrast in the city. But I want to ask you the draw to Beirut, in your experience, was the story part of the draw, in that were people curious about Lebanon itself when it came to your sort of from your side, or is it really just let's go have fun, we want to party, we want to just have a great time? The history and that kind of stuff is less important. We just want to have a good time and go, kind of like a party destination.
You mean with visitors or with outlets, like pitching stories about?
Sorry, with outlets, with outlets and what they sort of what they were curious about, as opposed to your own personal.
I would say there's kind of two approaches, or let's say three. There's the good one that people have read a lot of history and they know Lebanon is this kind of artistic center, cultural center, where there's lots of interesting things coming out of there. Then there's like the ones where they really want, especially, when the Syrian civil war was beginning or in the middle, people really wanted I'm going to a winery in the Bekaa, and just a mile away, or like a few kilometers away is like the Syrian border. That kind of gonzo. I don't even think gonzo is the right word for it. I consider that a bit exploitative. The kind of like, I'm here in the luxury, and then here's this terrible thing that's happening, but I'm not actually in danger.
Right.
And then I think the third would probably be the kind of fun. Definitely Lebanon has an international reputation for being a fun country.
Sure, absolutely.
And I'm always surprised, having lived in Lebanon and always say, no, I live in Lebanon, how many people, it's kind of, you must get this all the time. Like, you kind of get this 50-50 reaction. Like, some people think that you are living in a bomb shelter, and then some people think that you are just partying all night. And
in the bomb shelter.
Yeah, in the bomb shelter, just like craziness. And I can't imagine many other places in the world have those kind of dual images.
You're right. And I mean, it's the most obvious example. I think there are, I've been to Sarajevo, and Sarajevo has a little bit of that, but it's sort of, it's in perspective, and it's locked. It's a brief period of time. Lebanon, it's existential. It's been decades and decades and decades of this kind of rift.
Have you noticed, one thing that I found interesting with the coronavirus is just my Lebanese friends and like the group chats that I'm on, it is like an entirely different reaction than people in New York. Like, everyone is like doing these like group meditations, and we're cleansing the world, and like all the Lebanese people think this is like a very good, not good, I mean, but they're looking at this in a very optimistic way. Whereas I feel like Americans are just running around, like no idea.
Honestly, I mean, from my own experience so far has been in New York and Manhattan, and to me that is I mean, it's so extreme to see this city asleep,
Yeah.
and properly asleep. But then you see, I mean, I left Beirut late January, so I didn't. Were you there when right before the coronavirus lockdown
Yeah,
started?
so I was planning on moving back to the States on March 18th,
Hmm.
and I had to leave early. I left on March 11th.
Okay, so just really within days, a week or so.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about the photos I've seen of Beirut, no pollution, which is insane. I mean, it's really different, and that's something I wish I could have seen on my own, or at least breathed that
That's
relatively fresh
nice.
air.
Yeah.
Yeah, I my favorite time of the year is February, partially because it's cleaner to a degree. It rains more.
Mm.
The dust is settled, but that's just like a shower or two, and then it goes back to that usual pollution, that sulfur, that yellow haze over
Yeah.
the country.
That
It's just
smell
shocking not to see that.
when you walk out of Rafik.
Yeah, 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 yeah. You don't, I mean, I don't know what that would be like to
Yeah, what
walk
does
out
it smell like at
without.
Rafik right now?
My guess is it still has a stench because that trash mountain is not going away because of
That's
the
true.
pandemic.
That's true.
Maybe not, it's not as fresh of a stench. I part of the reason actually I wanted to talk to you as well is because I I like when people visit Lebanon and then sort of they they find themselves in the country in very creative ways. And we don't know each other that well, but we've seen each other a few times, and I didn't know. I had no idea that you're a surfer.
Oh.
Then I see a photo, this like crazy photo of a surfer. I think it was in Betrun, if I'm not mistaken. It's just sort of you riding a wave, and I'm like, I know that girl. What is she doing? And I there are people that try to surf in Lebanon, but just not known for it. There isn't a big scene, and I've seen in the last few years that there's a scene that is
Mhm.
beginning to grow, and I think you're part of that. You're part of the reason that people are surfing more. Can you just tell me about that world? Because I don't know anything about surfing. I don't associate it with Lebanon. I associate it with California or Hawaii. I don't think of, the Mediterranean coast as a surfer-friendly coast. Is that something you just sort of wanted to see if it would happen and you tried it and it worked? Or did you always want to do that and you sort of just said, yeah, of course, the Mediterranean, that's where you go to surf?
That's the Well, I grew up surfing because my mom is from California, so I'm like a third generation surfer.
Third generation surfer. That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean,
It runs in the
my
family.
grandpa taught me, and my grandma taught me how to
Oh,
boogie
that's
board. So
crazy. Really?
that's really
Wow.
cool. Southern California.
Yeah.
But when I was never like in my family, we always surf when we have reunions or we get together. Like it's just a part of my family's culture. My mom.
It's a nice
Um,
culture.
yeah, no, it's really I as a kid, like I never thought it was that big of a deal. And then like I have this memory with my grandfather. We were like looking through some old surf books and he's like, "Oh, that guy was our neighbor." Or like,
Wow.
and you're like, "Whoa," like they were living it in this time when it became popularized, like in the 50s and 60s
Mm,
for the
mm.
whole world. So when I moved to Lebanon, I always knew how to surf, but then I think when I was around that time, I realized that like nature and the water was really important to me, especially having lived in New York City for 6 years previously. So I the water was a big draw for me in Lebanon, and then
Right.
the surf scene there, I became good friends with Paul Abbas, who's the surfboard shaper, who he actually was just featured in Surfer magazine. It's amazing. It's so cool. So I became good friends with him and his girlfriend, Fernanda. And then the surf scene there is just really, it's an amazing subculture because, people, first of all, it's all different people from all over the country. Tends to be wealthier because surfing in general is like a wealthier sport.
Mm.
But in terms of religious diversity, it is. And people like growing up in New York, here it's cold water and there's competition, especially in the summer for
Right.
waves. In
Right.
Lebanon, people will be like, hey, the surf is going to be here tomorrow morning. I'm coming to your house and I'm picking you up. And
Right.
everyone is kind of like, I never had a car when I was in Lebanon, and I would get rides to Jie, I would get rides to Sheka. People, and you'd ask a friend and they'd be like, no, I can't give you a ride, but my other friend will take you.
So it's just easier in that sense to get your surfboard and go.
Yeah, or just I think because there was surfing in the 70s. This guy named Mustafa in Jie was a
Mm.
surfer. But then people say like because of the war and just everything that was going on, it was like 10 or 15 years ago that it kind of started again. And in Batroun, it was mostly windsurfers. In Jie and Beirut, it was mostly like snowboarders.
But let me ask you, this is a very amateur thing. I know very little about surfing, and it's you're a third generation surfer, so I can ask these questions. Um, is it better to have turbulent weather in the Mediterranean to surf? Because I assume in the summer months, it's a very calm
Well,
experience.
that's a good question. That's the hard part about learning how to surf in Lebanon.
Uh-huh,
Like,
yeah.
because the thing, in general, surfing is difficult to learn, not because the sport is inherently more difficult. It's just that you are so dictated by nature. So if you want to learn, like going on a week trip to Sri Lanka, that's great. You're going to learn a lot in that week.
Mm,
But every time there's surf, you have to be willing to go surf. So
right.
that's the difficulty. And it really, because it's this combination of like athleticism, but then also balance and paddling, and you can do other exercises to boost all of that, but really surfing consistently is kind of the only way to get better, like with any sport. But in Lebanon, because of the Mediterranean, like in the winter is the best time for it.
Right, right. I would assume that because even in the winter, it's still not crazy waters, but at least there is some drama.
Yes. And so the one big drawback of Lebanon surfing is apparently Cyprus blocks. So it's called like a wind. Mostly it catches these kind of wind swells that travel
Mm,
all across the Mediterranean, and they hit Lebanon and Israel. And Israel isn't blocked by Cyprus. So the way that the wind swell comes across,
that's
Cyprus
interesting.
blocks the direction that you want the swell to come to hit Lebanon. So
Right.
that's why Israel has like there's a lot of reasons, but they get more waves than Lebanon
Mm.
because of Cyprus, which is like funny because I feel like in the Lebanese surfing scene, it's like everyone knows it, but no one will talk about it. Like,
No, but so in other words, the western coast of Cyprus would be more active because of that kind of
no, so it has to do with how far also the waves travel. So
uh-huh, uh-huh.
but to be honest, I don't think that they travel far enough. So like
Interesting.
most of the places in the world where there's amazing surf, it's because it's the waves have traveled like a very far distance. So they have a lot of power, but the problem is like with a wind
Right.
swell is that you're
Yeah.
also getting the wind with it. Whereas like
Mm,
in
mm.
Hawaii, a swell has traveled thousands of miles and you don't have a storm at the same time. Whereas in Lebanon, you're pretty much, if you have really good waves in the winter, you're usually in a storm. So then it's like windy. So then you have a very short window of time that the conditions would be really good.
And that window of time means, I'm guessing, it's sunny, it's not raining, there's no storm, right?
Not not that you let go of that part of it. More,
Oh, okay.
it would be like usually in the winter you would get like a 3 to 6 day swell, and kind of like the 2 days on the beginning or the 2 days on the end would be good. In the middle,
Mhm.
it's just so stormy and there's no like shape to the waves because there's so much of a system that it doesn't work.
Right. Now the winters, the water's not very appealing, and the Mediterranean, it does get cold. Nothing like the Atlantic here. That's a different
No.
story. But are you the only person, are you the only group swimming and surfing at that time of the year? Because I don't see anyone in December jumping into the water, enjoying their time. Is it in a way a lonely experience?
That's actually where I will say one point for Lebanon is that it's really hard to be lonely in Lebanon. I feel like whenever I would go, like in Beirut, I was living like 10-minute walk from the surf, and I could see it from my flat window, which was awesome. So I
Mm,
would like walk down, and sometimes I'd be like, oh, okay, looks good. And invariably, like a friend comes and watches me, and not even contacting them. They just see the waves, and then they kind of join you. And I think that
right.
communal aspect of it is, in general, in surfing, it's really nice. In Lebanon, I think because the scene is beginning, it's even more. Whereas in places where it's really popular, there's more competition and stuff.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, in general, I also think Lebanon is a very communal, there's a communal aspect to the culture and to life there.
I like that you can't even go surfing alone, even if you wanted to. You'd
Yeah,
have people showing up surfing with you.
I remember like one of the first times I went to Jbel, I was like on the beach reading, and this like family came up to me and they're like, "Do you want to sit with us? Like, are you okay?" And they like felt so bad for this like lonely foreign girl.
Little did they know that you're a third generation surfer, travel reporter, just you wanted some time alone.
Yeah, which is impossible to get in Lebanon.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm gonna flip it now to the US, and just I know you only came back less than a month ago. And was that a planned trip to come back to America? Did you sort of were you ready to leave Lebanon, or is it something that came up and you decided, I need to move back?
Um, I think I grew up in a close family, and so it's always been hard for me to be far away from them. And I think the past couple years, as you get older, I'm like, oh, it would be nice to live in the same place for a few years and
Right, right.
have that kind of closeness with family. I also wrote the first draft of a book that is about my hometown and about the farming culture here, because we're one of the first family farming areas in the U.S.
Uh-huh.
And so those two impetuses it's hard though, because I'm sure you feel this as well, and in many ways I feel like that's a very Lebanese experience, the kind of being pulled between these two things. Like
Sure.
I, yeah, I felt that my time in Lebanon, I needed to reconnect to the U.S. because I'm sure you've met these kind of international people or expats that kind of, they bounce around from place to place. And then by the time they're like 50 or 60, they aren't really attached to anywhere. And they'll say things like, oh, the sushi in Kenya is the best. And you're like, what does that even mean? And I'm not nothing against those people, but I don't want to be that.
So, I mean, this is maybe you tell me if this is too personal, and as you say as much as you'd like. Did Lebanon ever properly feel like home after spending that much time? Because I like the way you're describing it. It's almost like there's a window where you can be fairly free and do as you wish there, but you know that there's a sort of a bedrock waiting for you, and that the moment will come when you return. Or did you actually feel like, no, I could perhaps stay in Lebanon and I don't know, maybe settle down with a Lebanese surfer and have your own sort of surfing family from Betroun? I mean, did it ever feel like it would be home, really home, that you would leave New York and the States behind?
In a strange way, I think that was the decision that I made moving
Mm,
back. I did. I think I realized, especially living in, like, I'm from a small beach town, and living in a small beach town and realizing, like, I mean, I obviously don't look Lebanese. Everyone knows I'm a foreigner there. And then, but
you look
knowing
more Lebanese than I do, and I,
that
I, I mean, I barely pass, but you can pass. You're
I don't
fine.
think so. I don't think so. You must get that a lot, though, I would imagine.
As I age and expire, I look more, I think, of just the belly kind of gives it away now. It's like, oh yeah, he's from that part of the world. The extra hair that's kind of coming out of nowhere, I think it's finally coming back. I don't look Finnish anymore. I look, Lebanese.
It is funny that monoculture, though, like how people can so easily say, like, you are Lebanese or you are not, especially as an American, because
Mm,
that would never be something that I would think or say, but because it's a small place, you can actually inform
Sure.
me. But yeah, living there and thinking, and in my town in Southampton, we have a new mayor. There's all these people that this last summer I was visiting, and my mom's friends were trying to get me on all these environmental groups to clean our ponds, and kind of thinking like, okay, I want to have an impact on my community. And if I'm in Lebanon, especially in Beirut, there were a bunch of developments happening at the beach, and I would like go and I would yell at them, and
Yeah.
it got to the point where it's like I'm either committing and this is my life, or I'm going to move back to the US, because I don't want to be that angry foreigner yelling at Lebanese people and telling them what to do, kind of.
Interesting. So you, in a way, that it's a moment that passed naturally. It kind of ended on your terms to a degree. You saw that this was the time to leave, and you left.
Yes.
I actually read that piece about from the Southampton Press. There was a little article that I saw about you returning home. It's funny when I see these things. I keep like, I know this person. It's like, oh yeah, of course I know her. So you keep showing up in interesting ways, and that's what actually triggered me to get in touch when I was like, oh yeah, she's here. She's in New York. But it speaks to the moment that you're not so far away, and we have to do this way. And I'm going to wrap it up with asking you, do you see that your future in the States will revolve around this type of storytelling? Because I know travel reporter means you have to in a way you have to travel. Are you sticking to that, or is it sort of more on the sort of home and maybe the going back to your roots in a sense, fiction writing and sort of taking care of more immediate concerns here?
I do think that was one advantage I had of being a travel journalist in Lebanon, was that anything I pitched to any American publication, it's kind of automatically sexy because it's so far away,
Right.
Like they wouldn't necessarily send someone to, like I did a story about like the best menaish in Lebanon, and like it was a really fun, cute story, but there's no travel editor that's going to have me do like the best New York pizza,
Sure, exactly. Yeah.
But I think my plan right now, I mean, I do want to kind of continue my connection to the Middle East. So I've been trying to do more. I mean, now because of Corona, everything's kind of upended. But the original plan was to kind of do like a bigger business Gulf story that would kind of keep me traveling to the Middle East at least like once or twice a year. And try to do then like go to a place and do a few travel stories there.
So you anticipate that you'll be connected to that part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't, I have too many connections to the Middle East. And even now, like I'm finding myself, like I'm more used to that paradigm than I am to the American one. When I talk politics with people here and they're talking about this reporter or like this senator, I'm like, I don't have that history of them, but like, let's talk about Hariri and, like Waleed Jumblat, like what's his deal, like I don't connect to that the same way. So I think I would be sad if I didn't continue that.
Domestic issues in America are domestic. They're very local, very confined. Lebanon, it's the world. Any local affair has like this global tentacle. So Waleed Jumblat, what he says about anything, what he says about the coronavirus, will have that kind of global reach.
Yeah, there is that interesting thing about Lebanon where I feel like in some ways people there understand the kind of like international life a lot more. Like I feel much further from my friends here with that part of my life than I do in Lebanon, because I think America, even though it's this world power, it's very localized and very domestic focused in a way.
Well, I'm really happy that you were able to do a number of things. First, you could fulfill your family obligation by surfing in Lebanon. That's very important. You also found a way to explore storytelling on your terms, and I like that you wanted to be reflexive in the experience and sort of have a personal stake in it, which you did successfully. And I'm really happy to know that you will have continued ties to that part of the world. And I look forward to sort of catching you in different outlets over time.
Yeah.
And I, if it's a first draft, I hope the novel comes out soon enough. We could talk about that at some point. So Alexandra, thank you for taking the time to do this during the middle of coronavirus, and I hope to see you in person soon enough.
Yes, thank you so much, Ronnie. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you.